Archiving started.
Hello, welcome to the next WIMBA lecture. This is a lecture on Congress, or the legislative branch. It's chapter 2 of the textbook. So hopefully this will be a good explanation of Congress, which is one of our least favorite institutions in the whole government. If you think about the institutions that people like the most, they like the Supreme Court, they like the presidency, but they hate Congress. Congress usually has an approval rating of about 8%. So for some reason, even though that's the branch we're closest to, people just tend to not like Congress very much at all. 3 branches of government. So this legislative branch is designed to make the laws, and then once it makes the laws, it hands them over to the executive branch. The executive carries them out. And then if there's ever a question of interpretation, then again it's passed to the judicial branch. So this is a good example of the separation of powers. So each branch of government has a different function. So most governments have a branch, tribes, cities, states, country. There's a specific legislative function where those are the folks who make the laws, and then they're carried out or enacted by the executive. So in this example, here we have President Obama is signing the law that Congress passed, and then it's his executive branch that will carry out that law. So in Oklahoma, the legislative branch, Oklahoma House of Representatives and the Oklahoma Senate. So Todd Thompson, I misspelled Thompson's name, Thomsen is his name, and Susan Paddock are the representatives from this district. In the House is Todd, and in the Senate it's Susan, and they're going to take office on February 7th. The 53rd Oklahoma legislature will go into session. And there's ways that we can get information about the kinds of laws that our legislative bodies are passing. There's tons of websites, both on the federal and the state level. City councils have open meetings acts that they have to follow. So you should always be able to know what the measures are that the legislative bodies are talking about, so that we, the people, can have some input into what's going on. All right, so how many members of Congress? We have 100 senators and 535 representatives, and the number of the Congress has to do with the 2-year interval starting to count when the Constitution was ratified in 1789. So since 1789, we've had 112 Congresses, and so this 112th Congress is the years 2011 through 2013. So everyone who serves during that 2-year period, it's called the 112th Congress. So from Oklahoma, these 5 men are the representatives who represent Oklahoma. District 5, James Langford, he's your new guy because Mary Fallon had been the representative from District 5. She resigned, or she did not run again in order to run for governor, and then a Republican was elected from the 5th District to take her seat. You should notice that of the representatives, we have 4 Republicans and 1 Democrat, and the 1 Democrat is named Dan Boren. If Dan Boren wasn't named Boren, I'm pretty sure he would not get elected. So Oklahoma is a very Republican state right now, and it takes a very moderate and Republican-pleasing Democrat, such as a Dan Boren type, to get elected. So Dan Boren is, of course, the son of David Boren, former senator, former governor, and current president of OU University. And so, obviously, the Boren family is very powerful. It would take such a powerful family to get a Democrat elected. So Mary Fallon had represented the 5th District, and before she had got elected, the last woman to represent Oklahoma in Congress was Mary Alice Robertson, who was elected in 1922. That was a long time ago. So there have been 2 women ever in the history of Oklahoma to go to Congress, and it's Mary Fallon and Mary Alice Robertson. Also, we have representing Oklahoma in the U.S. Senate, Jim Inhofe and Tom Coburn, and these gentlemen also are Republicans. So of the 7 representatives that Oklahoma has in Washington, 6 of them are Republicans and 1 of them is a Democrat. So each of the representatives in the House, they represent a certain district, but the senators have to look at the entire state as their district. A huge issue for 2011 coming up, both in the legislature and nationwide, is the concept of redistricting and reapportionment. Let me explain what I mean. This is a huge, important, and political issue. Between 1990 and 2000, Oklahoma had 6 congressional districts. These 6 districts obviously each had 1 member of House of Representatives who would represent them. So in the year 1990, and in the year 2000, there was a census taken, and this is how we know how many people live in the state of Oklahoma and in the entire country. So we see a census taken in 2000, and Oklahoma, although Oklahoma had a little bit of population, it lost a seat, it lost a district, because each of these districts tend to represent about 670,000 people. Oklahoma had grown slightly as a state, yet other states had grown more quickly, and because our population had only increased slightly, we actually lost a district. So if you can see the problem here, you can't just take this number 6 off the map and then combine it with something else. You have to redraw all the numbers. So the term redistricting and reapportionment, these are 2 different terms. So just to be clear, reapportionment is to change the number of seats or change the number of districts. And then redistricting merely means to redraw the lines. Okay, so if you're looking at the state of Oklahoma, who gets to do this? And the answer is the legislature of Oklahoma. So if the legislature is dominated by Democrats, then the Democrats are going to draw lines that are favorable to them. And if it's Republicans in charge, then it's the same thing. Republicans will draw lines favorable to Republicans. So check out these districts, 6 House districts in the period between 90 and 2000. Between 2000 and 2010, they redrew them with only 5 districts. And so you can see, it's sort of interesting to me the way they did this, because Pontotoc County is right here. Pontotoc County used to be lumped in with the 3rd district, which was more like this part of the state, but now it's lumped in with the 4th district, which is more like this part of the state. We're linked more with the west than the east. So that's an interesting situation. So just remember, this is the most important point here. Redistricting is redrawing the lines. Reapportionment is changing the number of representatives each state has. And who gets to decide how the lines are drawn? The answer is the state legislature. And are they fine and fair? Well, as fair as anything is in politics. We're not the districts are going to look next time, but this is Speaker-elect Chris Steele of the Oklahoma House of Representatives. He was here on campus this summer, and he says if he has any say-so as Speaker, the new districts will be very fair. There's a term for the idea that you're going to draw districts that benefit yourself, and the term for this is gerrymandering. If you are a gerrymander, you draw the districts in such a way that help you out or hurt your opponent. The Supreme Court has generally said gerrymandering is acceptable. They basically said, and I quote, the boundary lines cannot be bizarre. If the lines are bizarre, then a district might be held unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. This is an example of the old 5th district. Not bizarre. So if that's not bizarre, I'm not really sure what is. Moving on to a different point. This is just to point out the composition of the members of the House and Senate. First of all, you should be aware that the Senate is currently controlled by Democrats and the House is controlled by Republicans. And this is a switch from the last Congress where the Democrats held both the House and Senate. So we're moving into a different climate right now politically. and Senate, you see a slight increase in women in both the House and the Senate. Under the 110th Congress, there are only 16% women, but now under the 112th Congress, there are 18% women in the Senate, and there are 21% women in the House. So these numbers continue to rise. Some people argue that we should have a whole bunch more women in the House and Senate, maybe even half should be women, until more women get interested and get involved in things. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's interesting to watch these statistics. There's one African American in the House, 44 in the Senate, in the Senate, and 44 in the House. Small representation of Asians and Pacific Islanders. One American Indian. The American Indian in Congress right now is a Chickasaw Indian named Tom Cole, and he represents our district. So he's very aware of his role as the only Native American member of Congress, and he's super savvy politically. He has very good political skills. If he's in town during the semester, I really think we should go and listen to him talk, because he's extremely good at explaining things and talking to the people, and he will talk to as many people as want to talk to him. He's an excellent representative. The last point I want to make about the demographics of members of Congress, the average income of American families is about $42,000 a year. The average income of an Oklahoma family is about $24,000 a year. 71 out of the 100 senators are millionaires, and 28 out of the 435 members of the House are millionaires. It's hard to imagine that these millionaires clubs would be able to really understand how the average American copes with our day-to-day lives. What does it feel like to be tight on money, to have to decide if you should buy gasoline or groceries for your family? It's hard to believe that they would really understand as they set unemployment compensation, as they decide the minimum wage, as they figure out who should be able to get health insurance, that they really understand what. So I'm all in favor of programs and ways that members of Congress can get in touch with the average people and really see what people face on a day-to-day life. So that's sort of an interesting point to me. In the last Congress, a man named Keith Ellison was elected from Minnesota, and he was the first Muslim ever to be elected to Congress. And you see here he's taking his oath on these two books. These are Quran. So everyone's like, how can that happen in America, that someone should get to take the oath on the Quran? Well, they should read their First Amendment, because religious freedom is definitely one of the major points that we support. One of the things Nancy Pelosi, she's a member of Congress, said was, the more the tables of power reflect the beautiful diversity of our country, the sooner our policies will reflect the aspirations of the American people. If people in Congress look like America, and they come from the real American experience, and they're from a wide range of backgrounds, then policies in Congress will be improved. Why would you even bother having 100 senators if every one of them went to Harvard and had the same kind of job? They would all have the same opinion. There'd be no point to having more than one of that kind of person. If you have 100 of the same kind of person, you're not going to get the same sort of benefit you would get if you had a wide range of people with many different experiences, bringing their ideas and their experiences to Congress and policymaking. Members of Congress, think about representing the public. There are two basic ways that they do this. One is that if they do whatever the public says, that they would call that approach to their job being a delegate. So if the public says pass health care and they pass health care, then they're being delegates of the public. If the public says repeal Obama's Health Care Act and they repeal Obama's Health Care Act, then they're being delegates. So whenever they do what the people say, they're being delegates. On the other hand, the other form of representation is called being a trustee, where you don't do what the public want, but you do what's in the best interest for the public. So if they say pass health care, but the representatives decide that's not the best thing, they don't want to do it, then they might be acting as a trustee. acting on the best interest of their constituents, whether the constituents like it or not. Just to give you an example, Tom Coburn, a senator for Oklahoma, this is Tom Coburn here, came to ECU to speak a few years ago, and I asked him, okay, if you had to make a decision and cast a vote, and your gut said one thing, but every single person in your district was telling you to do something different, what would you do? Would you go with the people or would you go with your gut? And he said, no question at all. He said, these people have elected me. I would go with my gut. And if they didn't like what I did, then they can vote me out. But my job is not to do what they say. My job is to use my judgment and cast votes on their behalf. So that's a great example of a trustee. So this is Tom Coburn, Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma, definitely a trustee. Okay, so this next section of the discussion focuses on what Congress does, and what Congress does is pass legislation. The Constitution outlines what the Congress can do, and there are many places and sources of power that the Congress has. The powers of Congress are enumerated or listed in Article 1, and the major sources of congressional power are the Commerce Clause, which says that the states may the Congress may regulate interstate commerce, and then the Necessary and Proper Clause, which says the Congress may pass legislation that's necessary and proper to carry out foregoing powers. So the Tea Party, this is kind of interesting, but there's a movement in America right now, and it's called the Tea Party movement. But one of the things the Tea Party movement is insisting is when Congress passes legislation, they have to say exactly what source of authority they're relying upon from the Constitution. So if Congress was going to pass a law about health care, they would have to go to the Constitution and say, we're passing health care regulation because the commerce power or the general welfare power. You'd have to point to a specific part of the Constitution that justifies that congressional action. So that's kind of interesting because it goes back to the original understanding of the Constitution that the framers had, which was if it's not in the Constitution, then Congress can't do it. The Necessary and Proper Clause has been the biggest culprit for the expansion of federal power. And we'll talk about this later in the semester, but there was an important Supreme Court case called McCullough versus Maryland, and it was an 1819 case. McCullough versus Maryland said that Congress could do things that weren't in the Constitution. The Congress wanted to create a federal bank. It said that it was necessary for carrying out the commerce power, and they put this new bank in Maryland. And of course Maryland was upset. It was a violation of the fragmentation of powers that we talked about, and Maryland sued the federal government saying, it doesn't say in the Constitution that the federal government can create the bank. And Congress was like, well, it's necessary and proper that we do so. The question goes to the Supreme Court of the United States, and Chief Justice John Marshall says the Congress acted properly, and he allowed Congress to expand its powers under the Necessary and Proper Clause for the first time in a history. And then, it breaks loose, because after this has happened, then there's really no stopping the things that Congress has done. So McCullough versus Maryland is a pivotal Supreme Court case because it opened the door for unenumerated powers. Unenumerated powers by Congress. So this is a big deal, and we'll talk about it later when we get to the federalism chapter. Okay, I know you had high school civics. I know you're a political junkie, and you know all about Congress. But there are a couple of things I want to emphasize in this lecture that will help you understand even better what's going on in Congress. The things that we don't understand enough about are the party system and the committee system in Congress. Both of these systems have a very big impact on what goes on. System, it is very important that you realize if the majority party does not support legislation, it will not pass. Back in 2008 to 2010, when Democrats controlled both houses of Congress, if the Democrats didn't want something to pass, it's not going to pass. The control of the majority party of the House, the majority party of the Senate is critical to what legislation will be considered and what will pass. Okay, so Democrats gained control of the House and Senate in 2007, and Nancy Pelosi became the Speaker, and Harry Reid became the majority leader. As you know, in 2011, cross out Nancy Pelosi and insert John Boehner of Ohio. He has become the Speaker of the House, and he is a Republican. So it's sort of like opposite day, where anything Pelosi would have wanted to be done cannot be done now. Anything John Boehner liked under Pelosi would not have happened. So Boehner will call the shots in the House of Representatives, and Reid will continue to call the shots in the Senate. This is sort of just an interesting graphic. Blue is the color for Democrats for some reason, and red is the color for Republicans. So in states where you see blue, it's all Democrats in the Senate. In states where you see red, it's all Republicans in the Senate. And then the purple states, you see one senator who's blue and one senator who's red. So it's purple. So you can kind of see that we've got 53 senators who are Democrats, 47 who are Republicans, and then the two little blue dots in here, light blue. And you see up here, these are independents. They don't go with either party, but they caucus with the Democrats, which means they vote with the Democrats. They're considered Democrats for most purposes. In the House of Representatives, I think this is fascinating. This is broken district, and you can see how red the country is. Like after Obama had gotten elected in 2008, the same map would have just looked blue, blue, blue. And now, like, the whole country almost is just covered with red. The reason for this is that Democratic districts are going to be in cities, usually. Therefore, they're just tiny. Because if you've got to have 650,000 people, if you have a city of 1 million, then the blue district wouldn't even show up on this map. So because Democrats are concentrated in districts that are very tiny geographically, like, for example, in North Dakota, like district, that whole thing is one representative right there. That's North Dakota. Anyway, here's Oklahoma, you see, and it's all red except for Stan Bourne's district right there, the 2nd district. Okay, so party system. If you were not aware of how important party is in passing bills, now you are. Party is paramount. Party is huge. The committee system is also quite important. In the House and Senate, there are standing committees that continue to deal with certain issues like agriculture or armed services or health and human services year in and year out. So they have these standing committees that are always dealing with these issues. The committee chair is important because if the committee chair doesn't like a piece of legislation, if you're talking about the House, there can be 434 other House members who want to pass the bill. And if the committee chair just says, no, it's not happening, that committee chair can keep legislation from passing unless a very, very rare procedure is used where they can do an end run around that committee chair. Just from a practical standpoint, if you ever try to do an end run around a powerful person, you better really, really want to pay the consequences for doing that. So it doesn't happen very much. If the committee doesn't want to do a bill, it will die. Most bills, 90% of bills, are killed in committee. The committee system is so important and so powerful because most bills die in committee. They never make it out of this part. So in your textbook, there's a little diagram on page 55 of how a bill becomes a law. And I think it's the same as you'd see in any other textbook. But I want to push you to understand this in a new way. I call bill passing the 8 gates. And I like the idea of a gate because if you have to get through the gate. And if you can't burst through the gate, then you're trapped. And that's what happens to bills. They get trapped at different portions of this process. is introducing a bill. And this is probably the easiest part. Any member of the House and Senate can introduce a bill, and, maybe if a bill is super controversial, if you're an interest group or an individual, you won't be able to find someone to introduce it. But usually, with enough financial contributions to a re-election campaign, members are quite willing to introduce bills. So you introduce it, and the bill is immediately assigned to a committee. That process is called referral. I introduce my bill, and it's immediately referred to a committee. The committee can do anything it wants to with the bill. Let's say we're going to have a bill that is federal grants for students. So every student who enrolls in a public university gets $5,000 a year as a grant. So this bill is introduced. It gets referred to Education Committee. Let's say that the committee is looking at this bill and they think it's a fantastic idea, but they think $5,000 is not quite enough. Let's do $10,000. So they change the amount to $10,000. They can change the bill in any way that they want to. The process of editing the bill in committee is called markup. They mark up the bill, and throughout this markup process, they can change it however they like to. So if they like it, then they'll all vote. And let me just remind you how important party system is. Parties dominate every single committee in the House and Senate. If there are 17 members on the committee, 10 of them will be majority party, 7 will be minority party. Every single dominated the majority party. So, you can see how the Speaker of the House can be so powerful. Because if he tells the committee to not vote for something, they have to follow their leader, basically. So most legislation dies in committee after the referral step. In the third step, in the House of Representatives particularly, there's a powerful committee called the Rules Committee. Because the House has 500, they have much more strict rules about how, when bills are discussed, how long they're discussed for, who can add amendments, what kind of amendments can they be. And so the Rules Committee figures out what kind of rule goes along with the bill. So if you get your bill out of committee, but the Rules Committee doesn't like your bill, they will not schedule it. So you could get it out of committee, but it just never gets scheduled, so then no one else can vote on it. So that's another gate. Okay, so let's say the bill comes out of committee. It's for $10,000 for every student enrolled in a public university. Rules Committee likes it. They put it on the schedule. Now we get to the floor debate and vote. In the House, there are strict rules about what kind of amendments you can have during floor debate and vote. Only what they call germane amendments, or amendments that have to do with the subject of the bill, can be added. However, in the Senate, you can have non-germane amendments. You can have all kinds of amendments, things that have nothing to do with the bill. So the bill could be about student loans, but then the Senate could add in something about abortion to the bill. And they can do that because they can add any kind of bill that they want. Let me just draw you a little diagram. I want to make a point about this process, because a lot of times when legislation is introduced, it's introduced at the same time into the House. That's the House of Representatives, and this is the Senate. Okay, so you introduce it into the House and the Senate at the same time. Here's my bill, student aid. Okay, so we're being introduced into the House and Senate at the same time. The bill can be altered during the committee action, so each Senate or House committee could amend it differently. It can be amended differently during the floor debate and vote, because the House has to only add germane amendments, but the Senate could add all kinds of things. So the bill, when it comes out of the House and Senate, it might come out of the House, and in the House, let's say they decided it would be $1. But in the Senate, they only decided it was going to be $5,000, and they're going to ban abortion. Okay, so you got your bill introduced. It's gone through this process. It gets passed by the House and Senate by a majority vote, but their bills are completely different. So think about that issue. How are we going to resolve that issue? It's a big problem. One other difference in the rules between the House and Senate is the Senate can filibuster a law, and the reason that they would do that is to prevent the bill from coming up to a vote. Like if the rule is you're going to debate it for 2 hours and then vote, well, if someone filibusters for 10 hours, then you can't have your vote. So usually it's just the threat of filibuster, and not people don't actually filibuster to make a point. The longest filibuster in history was Strom Thurmond filibustered for over 24 hours against the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which passed anyway. So too bad for him. To resolve that issue we were talking about, where we have different bills in the House and Senate, they're passed all the way through. For a bill to become a law, you have to have identical language in both the House bill and the Senate bill. There has to be some way to reconcile the differences between the two laws. So I'm sure you're thinking that one way you could do this is you have your House and you have your Senate. So you send the bill up through the House, and then the bill is all passed and it's all beautiful and fantastic. So then you have to send it to the Senate, but when it comes out of the Senate, it's completely different. Then what you got to do is you got to come back and start it at the House again. The House is going to be mad because it got changed from the way they liked it. They're going to change it back. It's going to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and this process has to be completed in 2 years, or the Congress will end. Remember the 112th and now, and then you've got to start over. So it doesn't work to do one at a time. What you really have to do is introduce the bill into both houses at the same time, and then figure out some way to take the different bills and to reconcile them into one bill. The way we do it, it's called the Conference Committee. The Conference Committee is a committee made up of members of the House and Senate who are in place to reconcile the difference between the House bill and the Senate bill. It's done, what they reconcile those differences, and then they issue what they call the conference report. The conference report is then sent back to the House and Senate to be accepted either yes or no with no amendments. So there are a lot of issues, I think, that go against our democratic spirit with this kind of legislation. The conference committee meet in secret. Actually, a lot of times they don't even meet. They just circulate memos to each other. In this process, they can put anything they want to in that bill. And one of the things they do a lot is they include pork barrel projects into the legislation. So remember what our bill, let's say the conference report, they're writing the conference report, they decide on a compromise between the 5,000 and the 10,000. Let's say they're going to have grants for college students in the amount of $7,500. They're not going to ban abortion. They're also going to include a pork barrel project, PBP, pork barrel project, in the amount of $100 million for Oklahoma road. So there's a road in Oklahoma that needs repairing, and so they're going to put in $100 million for a road to be fixed. So when the conference report comes back, the members are like, oh, good, the bill's here. Oh, good, we're getting ready to move forward. And then they're like, $100 million for Oklahoma? This is ridiculous. They would never want to do that. But if they really want this bill to pass, they can't cross anything out. The conference report has either yes or no. And if they vote no, how are they going to explain that to their people? You know, why are you against students? Why are you against money? This is terrible. In Oklahoma, this can go even further because the Oklahoma legislature passes things called shell bills, where a piece of legislation is introduced to through the House and Senate, and it has no text. It's merely a title. It'll say, a bill. It goes all the way to the House, all the way through the Senate, all the way to the conference committee. It's blank. When it gets to the conference committee, they put the language in the bill. They send it back to the House and Senate for approval, either yes or no. You have no committee hearings. You have no collection of data to research the bill. You have no input from the public. You have no debate and vote either in committee or on the House or Senate floor, it's yes or no. So that's what we do in Oklahoma. Yay! It's so fantastic. Of course, if you have this shell bill and maybe you only have 20 minutes to look at it before you're voting, the only way that you can figure out how to vote is to ask your party leader. Okay, if it's sponsored by a Democrat or sponsored by a Republican, then you got to vote for it if that's your party. So, shell bills, that's Oklahoma's special twist on this. Okay, so the sixth gate here is members of the House voting to approve the compromises made by the conference committee within the conference report. So the conference committee is made up, like I said, of members of the House and Senate. It's a different group for each bill. It's what they call an ad hoc committee because they put it together, and then on the next bill it'll be different people. But you know what? It's always controlled by the majority party. The contents of the conference report must be approved yes or no, with no amendments. So it is impossible for members of Congress to get rid of the pork. They have to accept that pork along with the bill that they want. So you're probably wondering why I'm emphasizing this so much. I think it's a really big issue. Pork barrel projects would not be accepted if they were put to a vote of the people, just the project itself, the $100 million for a road in Oklahoma. So it's a really easy way for them to overspend. I don't know if you're aware of that. It's $14 trillion, thousand, million, billion. And one of the ways we overspent so much and drove up the national debt so high is through irresponsible making practices such as these. If we scrutinized each of these projects, many of them would never get built. It would just be left to the states to build their own darn road. But because these projects can be put into legislation and people are blackmailed into accepting it, then it's enabled the country to overspend. So pork barrel projects, it's like the ultimate free rider problem because members of Congress love to get pork barrel projects for their districts, but all of America pays for them to the tune of $14 trillion. We can't afford to do this, people, but very few folks are willing to put their foot down against pork barrel projects. One of the few people who is Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma. He hates pork barrel projects. He won't ask for them in Oklahoma. So he's one of the very few who really is making a difference with pork. Okay, so you got your conference report. It reconciles the differences of the House bill and the Senate bill. It's sent to the president. The president has two choices. He can sign the bill or he can veto the bill. If the president vetoes the bill, the veto can be overridden by 2/3 majority vote of both houses. So I just want to point out to you strategically, certain kinds of bills are not going to be vetoed by the president. If over 2/3 of the House and Senate, my phone is ringing. I don't know how to make it quiet. I don't know. It's just going to ring, I guess. If over 2/3 of the Senate pass legislation, we call that veto-proof because they can easily overcome the will of the president. So if that many members of the House and Senate vote for something, they're definitely not going to veto. The president's not going to veto it. Okay, appropriations. So that's the last step. In the Appropriations Committee, they decide which bills will be funded. So let's say you pass this great bill. It's going to have all this aid money for students all across America. Then the Appropriation Committee decides that it doesn't like the bill. Well, then you have a piece of paper. You have a great idea, but you have nothing to show for it. So the Appropriations Committee, which is also controlled by the majority party, has to agree to give you some money to enact your bill. Okay. So just to be clear about how important party process is in the system, if you're a Democrat and both houses are controlled by Republicans, you can just stay home most days because your ideas are not going to be enacted into law. It's just not going to happen. You're going to introduce legislation. It's going to die in committee. It'll die here at the committee process here. Even if it passes through the initial committee, the Rules Committee is probably not going to schedule your bill. If it gets scheduled, actually, the floor vote is almost always determined by majority party, so you're going to lose there. Even if it happens to get through the floor vote, conference committee dominated by majority party. Also, the president's party will probably determine whether he tries to veto the legislation, and then also appropriations. So during all of these steps, the number one consideration about success of a bill is the bill supported by the majority party? It's incredibly important. When I was in Washington last spring, I was talking to Senator Inhofe, and he was in the majority. When the Republicans were in the majority, he was a very powerful senator. He was chairman of a very powerful committee that was deciding where our money for roads was going to be spent all across the country. And I said, well, Senator, what's it like now that you're in the minority? Is that different? And he just said, are you kidding? It stinks. Like, for him, it's no fun at all. He can have a fantastic idea, and the only way it can be enacted into law is if he convinces a Democrat to do it or gives the idea to the Democrats. So, I mean, it's just party, party, party all day long at Congress. So last statement I want to make here, although it's the people's branch, people don't trust the Congress. This is where we're supposed to go for assistance with our government. Will Rogers said, this country has come to feel the same way when Congress is in session as when the baby gets hold of a hammer. People have very, very little respect for Congress. One of the more current events we've seen is the terrible shooting of Representative Giffords of Arizona. It's interesting to me, the upswell of support for her, and I wonder if the incident, as horrifying as it was and the deaths of all those other people, is going to do anything to sort of raise the esteem of Congress in the eyes of the public. So I think it's going to be interesting to see. Anyway, I know it's a big old chapter, but I hope you understand Congress a little more. Don't forget about the influence of party in any legislative branch. It's extremely important.